Alright, so moving on, just to confirm that on Marshmallow and above, the permission won't have been granted when the app was installed. It's important to note that it is the case on previous versions prior to Android Marshmallow that the permission's granted when the app's installed, but on Marshmallow and above, that's not the case. The permission won't be granted at install time. So what that means is when the first time we run the app, we'll get a permission _ denied, and we'll have to request the permission from the user. Now this is where things get a little bit interesting. Now it would be fairly straightforward, except that users have an option to deny permission and tick a box so that they'll never be asked again. I think a flowchart would be useful here to understand just how things work. So when we check the permission by calling the check self permission method, we'll automatically be granted the permission on devices running API 22 or earlier. So that bit's easy and there's nothing more we need to do in that case. But on API 23 and above though, we have to request permission from the user. Now that's still quite straightforward. If the user grants the permission, then we can proceed and everything's fine. The user may decide to deny the permission though. So let's have a look at what they'll see the first time they're asked to grant the permission. So if the user allows the permission, then that's fine, but if they do choose to deny it, then we have to decide what we're going to do and how we're going to deal with that situation. Now in some apps you could just disable the particular functionality that requires the permission. But in this app though, that's not really an option. That's because all the app really does is access the contacts records, and without the necessary permission to do that, it's a bit of a pointless app. It actually gets slightly more complicated because the next time the app is launched after the permission has been denied, the dialog actually offers another choice. You can see that don't ask again showing. So when the user ticks that option, or ticks that box, the only option provided is to deny the permission. Now this can be a bit confusing to us as developers, and unfortunately the documentation doesn't make it very clear, but when they choose to allow the permission, then they won't be asked again. That's automatic. Once you've allowed the permission, then it remains allowed unless you go into the settings to change it, and we'll have a look at that later. If the user ticks that box and denies the permission, they won't be asked to allow it again. So our app just won't get the permission and we'll have to cater for that in our code. Now once again, some apps could just disable the particular functionality that needs the permission, but our contacts app becomes pretty useless without it, given that that's all it really does is access the contacts. So going back to this flowchart, we can see that the situations where permission is granted are easy to deal with, and we'll leave the situations where permission is denied for now and come back to that once we've got the app working. Alright, so in terms of code, the Android framework provides methods to handle requesting the permission from the user at runtime. The first thing we have to do is check the value we got back from calling check self permission though, the code on line 38. So let's add the code to actually do that. So I'm going to put this code after the log. So we need to do if has read contact permission is equal to, it'll be package manager dot permission _ granted. So if we got permission granted, we'll add some logging here, log D, and we'll put permission granted. That's actually what happened. And we'll set our variable read contacts _ granted to true. We now have got access. We'll put an else in here as well, the log D, and this one is going to be for requesting permission. So requesting permission. And then we're going to type activity compat dot, and it's going to be request permission, and to pass that, parameters to pass to that will be this, then new string array, and then in curly braces read _ contacts. Then we need to add another comma, and it's going to be request code read contacts. Alright, so what have we done there? Well, firstly, if the result we got back from calling check self permissions was permission _ granted, then we have the permission we need and we can actually carry on. But we also need to know that we have the read underscore contacts permission later before we try to access the contacts when the floating action button's clicked. So we're storing true in the read underscore contacts underscore granted field. Now we could just call the check self permission method every time we need to know if a permission is granted, but for now I'm just going to store the result and just make that call once. Now that's a common thing to do, but it's actually often a bad idea. So I'm going to demonstrate the problems it can cause us later. But moving on with our code, if the permissions wasn't granted, then what we need to do at that point is we need to request it. And we can do that by calling the compat version of request permissions, as you can see that I've added on line 49. Once again, there's a method built into the framework, but that will only work on API 23 and above. Earlier devices don't know about this new security model, so they have to use the compatibility versions of the methods from the android.support.v4.app package, and that's where the activity compat comes into play. So if you're targeting API 23 and above, the code will almost the same, but you can leave off the context compat and activity compat class names when calling the methods. I say almost the same because you don't have to pass this to the framework methods. The framework check self permission is called on the context and request permissions on the activity, so there's no need to pass this to provide either the context or the activity to those methods. But the compatible request permissions method does need to know the activity though, and that's why on line 49, the first parameter is this. Alright, so next we provide an array containing the names of the permissions that we're requesting. Now we only want to request a single permission, but it still has to be provided in a string array because that's the type of the parameter. And we can check that by just having a look. Request permissions. You can see there the parameter java.lang.string array is what it's looking for the permissions. There's actually quite a bit of a description in here. It's quite long. So it's actually well worth you taking the time to read that to find out more about what's actually happening here. You may want to read it though after you've got the app working though, because we're going to be writing the onRequest permission result callback method next, and it may actually make more sense once you've seen the working code. In fact, I suggest you do wait until after we've got our code working. Now, although the code samples in this documentation are fine, the actual documentation itself can be a bit confusing and has resulted in some overly complex code appearing on the internet. Now, the earlier version of this document gave the impression that the app had to call request permissions every time it runs, which isn't the case, as we'll see shortly. In fact, if you read the documentation in a certain way, you could still get the impression that you have to call request permissions every time. So we go back to the documentation page again, and we'll just do a search for requesting permissions at runtime. There's this one here. And just down here under check for permissions, if your app needs a dangerous permission that was listed in the app manifest, it must ask the user to grant the permission. Android provides several methods you can use to request a permission. Calling these methods brings up a standard Android dialog box, which you cannot customize. So once you've seen how we're going to write the code for this app, read through this documentation and it should all make more sense than trying to work out to that from the document alone. Alright, so getting back to our code again. And the final parameter here, now again on line 49, the request underscore code underscore read underscore contacts, that's a request code, and I used the constant that I created earlier to send the right to value to it. Now the reason for that constant is because when you call the request permissions method, you don't get the result back straight away. So the system pops up the dialog that we saw in the slides earlier, then asks the user to grant the permissions. So if our onCreate method waited for the user to either grant or deny the request, then our app would be blocking and things like answering incoming phone calls wouldn't be possible. And we discussed that when we were looking at async tasks in the top 10 downloader and Flickr browser apps. It's not a good idea for our apps to block the UI thread and prevent the users from answering their phones. So to get around this, the Android framework displays the dialog and the request permissions method returns immediately. Now to find out whether the permission was granted or denied, we have to implement a callback method that will be called once the user has made the decision. So let's go ahead and write that, and I'm going to put that right under the onCreate method. So let's override the method, And the one we're going to choose here is I'll actually just do a search for on REQ. And that should bring us to this method here, on request permissions result. Press enter there. And then I'm going to delete the super code because we're going to actually write all this code ourselves. Right, so let's start with a log D start so that we know when the method started. Then we're going to do a switch on request code. In case, it's going to be request underscore code, which has come up, underscore read underscore contacts. And set up a code block. And we're going to put if request was cancelled, the result arrays are empty. We put if grant results dot length is greater than 0 and grant results the first element, the element 0, that's equal to package manager dot permission underscore granted, then permission was granted, yay, and do the contacts related task you need to do. So here we'll put a log D in there and we'll put permission granted. Then we'll also set read underscore contacts underscore granted equal to true. And then we'll put an else in here, permission denied. Ooh. Then we want to disable the functionality that depends on this permission. And for now we're just going to put a log D in there and we'll just put permission refused. And what I'll do then, just as the last line of the method, we'll add a log D as well so we can see when this method ends. So I've lifted this particular code from this method almost verbatim from the documentation we're looking at. So we'll go back to the documentation again and we look in for the handle the permissions request response. You notice it's almost copy and pasted completely from there, so it's pretty much the same. We're going to add a bit more detail to it later to deal with permissions being denied, but for now it's going to give us an idea of what's actually happening. Alright, so I'm going to finish the video here now. In the next video we'll start actually doing a bit of debugging. We'll actually start running this on our API 24 device just to see what goes on and how this thing works. So I'll see you in the next video.